Hey, Bruce Naylor, the Boomer Consumer. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do so. It helps the channel a lot. And definitely hit that like button. This is going to be kind of a fun one to make, this video. I think this is my 8th attempt today to try to record this video. Every time I sit down in front of the camera, car comes by, whatever. At any rate, my problem, not yours. So as a reviewer and making these YouTube videos, you get asked questions all the time in the comments. I don't always have time to answer them all. So I thought I would sit down today and answer some of these questions and take it from the perspective of somebody that is new to the audio hobby, or somebody that's wanting to learn and try to address some of the questions that I get asked. Sometimes they're not questions, much more as kind of a theme of different comments that people make. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I get asked a lot is, hey, Bruce, and more or less, I'm just paraphrasing, what makes you qualified to talk about hi-fi? And that's a legit question, and certainly worth talking about. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but I've been around hi-fi for the last 50 years. So when the heydays of hi-fi, which I consider to be the 1970s, maybe even the early 80s, this was a time when most people had a system in their home. We didn't have the internet and a lot of other forms of entertainment we got today. So a lot of people, music was a big part of their life, and they would either have a nice little kind of what we call mid-fi system in their home, or they would have a big console stereo, something like that. But just about everybody seemed like had hi-fi. So I was exposed, all my buddies and their families with their system. And, I would go to hi-fi shops. The fairgrounds would have different vendors out there selling stuff. I think it was the state fairgrounds would put on a hi-fi type of expo and go down there and check that out. So I got a lot of exposure. And there was all these hi-fi shops around. Generally, they would have like two areas, one for kind of everybody, more affordable stuff, and then they'd have like a small room with the more high-end gear, your Nakamichis, Krell, Carvers, all that kind of stuff. That was not really that affordable for the mainstream. And then the bulk of their store would be devoted to companies like Yamaha and Sansui and Marantz and Pioneer. More affordable gear, but yet it was still really crazy expensive compared to how much money we were making back then. I could not even afford, the Pioneer stuff. I didn't make enough money. When you're making like $2.50 an hour and you're looking at something cost $800, pretty unaffordable. The point being that I had a lot of exposure to it. And then over the years, I kind of hung around with some audiophiles. I've always been interested, read every magazine that I get my hands on, because that's where you got reviews from, was from magazines. Or for a particular piece of gear, as long as it's more mainstream, you could probably audition it at the hi-fi shop. Boy, that has changed. Today, most people, I think, buy online their gear. They order off the internet. So how do they determine, how do you figure out what's good, what's not good, if you can't go to a hi-fi shop? Because these guys kind of moved on. They converted over to home theater and car audio, and a lot of them closed up, packed up their doors, and yeah, they're gone. Those stores, they're hard to find, hi-fi stores. And so that's a problem. Well, the way you do it is there's online magazines with reviewers, and then there's the YouTube reviewers. Well, all right. What kind of reviewers? Well, the reviewers fall really, for the most part, into two camps. There is the objective reviewer, and then there is the subjective reviewer. What's the difference? Okay. Objective reviewers go off of data, measurements. Some of them have very expensive gear. They're well versed on what to look for, and you get all this charts and graphs, and you're looking at sweeps, and you're looking at frequency response, you're looking for roll-offs, you're looking for spikes and different frequencies. A lot of data to consider, all right? And maybe they're chasing the flat frequency response. A lot of different things go into objective analysis. The question is, does it sound good? Okay, great. It looks like it measures perfectly, right? But there's a problem with objective reviews, because just because something measures well doesn't mean that it's going to be pleasing to your ear, right? Okay, then the second camp is your subjective reviewers who really into music. They've listened to a lot of different speakers and amplifiers and stuff. And over the years, they've learned ways to explain to you how something sounds through language. Now, I want to use this analogy very quick. I tend to probably put more stock into the subjective reviewer than the objective reviewer. Here's why. Using this analogy. Suppose you have never tried a piece of apple pie. Right? Never had it in your life. So there's two people. One's a baker, and one's a person who, maybe is a restaurant critic. Now, you talk to the critic, tell me what it tastes like. That's what I'm interested in. Is it good? Is it delicious? And the critic will say, well, I noticed a hint of a buttery flavor. The apples were kind of spicy and a little tart. There's general nice sweetness to it, that kind of thing. That kind of gives you a rough idea what it might taste like. But then talk to the baker. Well, or the objective. Well, I used so much flour, sugar, salt. I used so much butter, baked it for so long. The crust is a certain temperature for, and the weight is so much and the calories in there. But he won't explain to you what it tastes like. All he's doing is giving you all the numbers and everything. And provided all the ingredients are in the right way and the right amounts, it should taste delicious. But you see my point. My point being, just because something measures well doesn't mean that it's going to sound great. It may sound sterile or cold. It just may not have musicality to it. So that's all I'm saying. I do believe that you should pay attention to both. And there are some that try to do a little bit of both. They'll do an objective analysis and give you the data, and then they'll tell you, but here's what I really think is how it sounds. So, yeah, reviewers, pay attention. Not everybody knows what they're talking about, but I think they're doing their best with what they got to work with. Okay, and let's talk about budget real quick. Many get a lot of people asking, how much should I spend on my rig? And how much should I devote to, say, speakers and electronics? Let's talk about that just for a minute. Speakers, those are the foundation of your system. It's kind of like the foundation of your house. Right? And kind of a rule of thumb is somewhere between 40 to 50% of your budget should be spent on speakers. And there's some people going to argue just the inverse. You should spend more on the electronics. But I think generally speaking, your biggest investment is going to be those speakers. They're the voice of your system. They are something that if you get the right speakers and you're happy with them, you'll leave them in place and you'll probably upgrade electronics before you would speakers again. So, and there are whole kinds of speakers out there, bookshelf, stand mounts, there's floor standers. Whatever works best for your room, that's what you got to keep in mind. A lot of people are tight on space, or they don't want big honking speakers in their room. Maybe maybe their partner doesn't want a wall full of gear. That's where bookshelf speakers come into play, and their bookshelves are generally more affordable. The one thing about bookshelf speakers is that you should allow for the purchase of what's called a subwoofer to go with them. Because of their size, they can't really get that impactful low bass. Floor standers, on the other hand, are much larger, bigger cabinets, and they can generally have bigger woofers built into them. And many times you may not even need a subwoofer. Stand mounts are kind of in between back there. Wharfdale Lintons, love them. Stand mounts, three-way speaker. They got a bass and mid-range and a tweeter, which is not typical in bookshelves. Normally bookshelves just have like a mid-woofer and a tweeter and call it a day. So determine the kind of speaker you want. How does it fit in your environment? And do you have the room for it? There you go. Aesthetics are also important. Is it got a nice finish on it? Is it more furniture? Well, you get the idea. But pick out your speakers very carefully. I think that is the most important thing you're going to do in the very beginning. Speakers you're going to love. Okay, now let's talk about your musical sources just for a minute. Are you going to be primarily interested in vinyl, or are you going to be interested in digital? Digital comes either through streaming or a CD player. So let's talk about all that real quick. If you start off with vinyl, you're going to have the turntable, the cartridge, what's called the phono stage or phono preamp, as well as your amplifier, your preamp, and then your amplifier, and then your speakers. You may get, so you could have quite a bit of hardware invested in getting into a turntable and vinyl records. In addition, you'll need cleaning solution, and you can with vinyl, you can just go down this huge rabbit hole. Not that I'm discouraging you from it. I'm just saying know what you're getting into. Okay, no Crosley cruisers. Start off with at least a decent starter turntable. And the starter turntables generally have the phono preamp built in. You just plug them right into a pair of powered speakers and off you go. But if you really want the highest quality, you're going to need a regular phono stage and better amplification, etc. Now, as far as streamers and CD players go, that's digital. Here's the one thing I offer advice. The DAC chip, whether it's built into the streamer or the CD player, is generally not going to be the best. Okay, it might be good, not going to be the best. And whatever's in there is whatever in there. This is why I do recommend that you get an external DAC. You don't have to spend a lot of crazy money to get a great sounding DAC. Shit Audio makes a good DAC. Shelly Labs makes good DACs. There's a ton of them. Topping, SMSL. And here's the thing about some of these companies. They seem to produce a new DAC daily. But let's just get to the very basics. A DAC its job in life is it converts 1 and zeros into a musical signal, right? It's when it sends that signal out, when it outputs that signal, that audio signal, it uses what's called op amps. And those is what determines how that DAC is going to sound. How the filters that they use, all the math that these things do, that's what makes the difference. Now, there's basically two types of DACs, basically. There are what's called Delta Sigma DACs, base DACs, and then there are resistor ladder DACs. Delta Sigma is going to be, whether it's got a Sabre DAC chip in it, AKM DAC chip, a TI DAC chip in it, etc. Delta Sigma, that uses a series of resistors, some of them on a chip. And I think, personally, I like the sound of resistor ladder R2R DAC over Delta Sigma. But for reference, for my daily drivers, actually, the Topping D70 Pro Sabre sounds fantastic. It's my daily driver, and it's a great DAC. But you don't have to spend more than a few $100 to get a good sounding DAC. And, well, do your own research. But to me, having an external DAC with your CD player and your streamer pays dividends. Plus, you can upgrade it at a later date because this technology is constantly changing and improving. Amplifiers. Let's talk about those briefly. There is a well-made argument of the value of what's called separates over or all-in-ones or integrated. I happen to be a big fan of integrated amplifiers, especially ones that have a lot of analog stuff and doesn't have the Bluetooth and the built-in DAC and streaming. Why? Because that technology changes. What I do want is a well-made. I'd rather spend the money on better components in the DAC, better capacitors, transistors, etc. Well-made. That's what's important to me. So I think integrated amps offer a better value. There's somewhere between, say, a receiver and a standalone preamp and amplifier. And I think that I just feel that integrated offer an outstanding value. But if you want absolutely top-notch sound quality, you probably would do a little bit better with separates and balanced connections and all that. By the way, don't skimp on cables, the interconnect cables. The RCA cables, the ones that, you get with the streamers and the DACs and all that, they're generally going to put really cheap cables in it. Don't cheap out on cables, but you don't have to spend thousands of dollars on them either. If you want to spend $3,000 on a power cord, be my guest. But I don't really feel that it's necessary. We'll talk about what I call snake oil here in just a minute. Another question I get asked frequently, do I go new or vintage gear? Well, there is in between. So there is a secondhand market for stuff that's not terribly old, like 5 to 10-year-old gear that was high end. You can save a lot of money. You can get probably better made gear in electronics that are 4 to 5, 5 to 10 years old. You can save a lot of money, and you can get some really high end gear for a more reasonable price. That being said, when I think of vintage gear, I'm thinking like this back here. This is from the receiver from 1980, and the rest of it is from like even earlier. The bottom line is, unless you know your way around electronics, or you know a repairman, definitely not a vintage turntable, definitely not a vintage cassette deck. All right, electromechanical devices. The problem is the mechanical parts you can't find replacements for. If you can, it's not easy and will cost you a small fortune. And cassette decks, I have 5 of them. 3 of them are dead or have a problem in one form or another. For me, it's just fun, but I don't recommend, don't even go there with cassettes or reel-to-reels. Vintage turntables, unless it's been fully serviced and been redone, probably avoid that as well. Even though I have a vintage Denon, it's the DP65F, supposed to be the top of the line automatic turntable. There's no way I could find replacement parts for something in that thing if it failed. It just ain't happening. Cassette decks, the same case. So if you want to get into vintage, keep in mind it's going to require maintenance. If you get one off of eBay, a vintage receiver or whatever, it's probably going to need service by a good tech. And that can run into quite a bit of money. So know what you're getting into. But if you, for maximum peace of mind, try to use new. Especially if you're going with a turntable, I would recommend new turntables and new speakers over vintage just about all the time. Another thing I hear is audio, getting into hi-fi is super expensive. No, not really. In fact, it's actually more affordable than ever. Example, my Pioneer receiver sold brand new in 1980 for $800. Adjusted for inflation, that's $3,000 today. I can spend half that amount of money and get just as powerful as an integrated amplifier, full warranty, the whole 9 yards for half that amount, for around $1,500. Okay. And you can get a really nice sounding little Class D amp for $150, a little mini amp, and they sound wonderful. They do a great job. $150. Maybe it doesn't have all the bells and whistles this thing's got, but you get the idea. So it's never been easier to get hi-fi gear because of all the online sites you can get, purchase through. Of course, there's used marketplaces for hi-fi gear, etc. So it's never been more affordable than I think that it is today, period. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is what I call snake oil. And there is a lot of it out there in the audio world, okay? I'll give you an example. Cable risers. There's companies trying to sell cable risers for hundreds of dollars. If you don't know what a cable riser is, it simply lifts any cables you have laying on the floor up off the ground. Your speaker cables, etc. You want those up off the ground. The theory is that you get static electricity charges in your floor or whatever, and that it would cause interference with the flow of electrons through the cable. At any rate, any non-conductive material, put your cables on, get them off the floor, will essentially accomplish the same thing, and you can do it probably for free. So for me, that's a form of snake oil. $3,000 6-foot-long power cords. I don't get that. I think that's basically snake oil. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a high-quality power cord, but come on. That pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to kind of talk about in this video. So hopefully I've answered some questions. I've probably created more. But anyhow, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.